It doesn't seem to me that this kind of outcome is something that was necessary.
Alex O'Connor has been having some great conversations lately. And in this conversation with Francis Collins, they discuss the topic of the problem of evil and animal suffering.
And I understand the problem of evil. I'm not the first person to bring this up, right? But I do think that the theodicies that are often put forward about why evil exists, such as free will, such as soul building, such as higher order goods, just simply do not apply to the suffering of non-human animals. That seems to me utterly inexplicable. Even the very existence of animals at all seems superfluous and unnecessary if God creates the world with the intention to bring about human beings. Or maybe he creates animals because they're beautiful and they're great and they bring us joy. But at what cost? Like, if I gave you the opportunity to become a wild animal, a random wild animal right now, I could press a button and you're about to become a random wild animal somewhere in the world. And you think about the life that you're about to live, the death that you're probably about to experience, the fear that you're going to live until that happens. I think you'd kill yourself before I press the button.
Alex raises this same objection in his conversation with Cliff and Stewart on Modern Day Debate. His question presupposes quite a few things, but one of them is this idea of animal suffering before humanity falls into sin. Now, I can see how he gets here, but he makes the assertion without necessarily offering a reason for this view. To be fair, this is a clip. I haven't seen the full interview. Maybe he unpacks that a bit more in the full interview. So I want to put out that disclaimer at least. I think it's important though, because he is in fact making a claim. Another thing to keep in mind here is that in Alex's worldview, there is no objective morality. So why is he so opposed to animal suffering? From his worldview, how can he justify his feeling that this is wrong? I would also add, how can he know that animals are in fact experiencing suffering? From his worldview, this seems to be a difficult question for him to answer. I would say that they are to an extent experiencing some suffering, but from his worldview, I'm not sure that this is something that he can explain. The problem of evil is the toughest argument to deal with when talking about Christianity, and for good reason. That being said, the problem of evil is a problem every worldview must account for, not just Christianity. This is one thing I really appreciated about Cliff in his conversation with Alex. He repeatedly pushed back on this, asking for Alex to provide a better alternative. This is how William Craig unpacks this idea of animal suffering. This is from an older article, so his views may have changed, but nonetheless. Of course, it could be that the fall that explains the reality of animal pain and suffering is not Adam's fall, but Satan's fall. It appears that Satan's fall predates the creation of animals, and there's no reason, in principle, why Satan could not have intervened in the natural processes of creation to ensure that animals feel pain, who otherwise might not have. So appeals to the fall of Satan might have some explanatory value when it comes to animal pain and suffering. A second, though unpopular response to this problem is to deny that animal pain and suffering is real or morally relevant. Most will react to this response with incredulity. Isn't it just obvious that some animals experience pain and suffering? The answer to that question is yes and no. We do think it an item of common sense that animals experience pain and suffering, but the scientific evidence for this is not as strong as you might think. Of course, scientists all acknowledge that many animals display behaviors that make it look like they are in pain, but that is not good enough. He's not saying that we should just dismiss it or that this isn't a real thing. He's making the distinction between pain and suffering, which is important.
I do think your description, with the use of the word brutal throughout, is maybe a little extreme. That in fact, over all of these hundreds of millions of years of living things, there is incredible beauty in this tapestry of the things that have come to pass. And some joy has been experienced by those animals as well. I recognize most animals are not in a position really to be aware of their own mortality. So the idea that our idea of fear of death, which we carry around every hour, would be also felt in a broad way. I'm not sure that's true, but that's not sufficient. I can only understand this in the sense that, again, I see God as a God of order, having put in place natural laws that are going to govern the behavior of matter and energy. The idea that a creative process that involved a lot of supernatural interpositions in that effort was not the path that fit together with this rigorous, sort of scientifically well-designed plan, whereas evolution is this incredibly elegant way to achieve those goals. Yes, with a lot of pain and suffering, to be sure, although I don't think we have a full grasp of exactly what that experience might have been like hundreds of millions of years ago by all of those species. As long as you're going to say that life doesn't go on forever, all of those had to be ultimately dead anyway. So it's not as if it was only evolution that caused them to die. Many of them died a natural death. It's a hard problem, I grant you that. The data says that's what happened. So perhaps you will accuse me as a believer and then trying to rationalize that with the idea of why would God let that happen? And I do keep coming back to the idea that this feels like a reflection of God's interest in being a God of order, where once those laws are established, they're going to be followed. And at the very moment, at the Big Bang, the plan that would lead to us was in place, and it didn't have to be tweaked along the way the intelligent design people would say, in order to turn out right. It was perfect from the beginning with that outcome assured, and it wasn't blind, and it wasn't mindless.
You think about this idea of God being a God in order, and you have to factor that in. He talks about how the laws kind of have been established, and to an extent, they will be followed. I find it interesting that you'll hear people push back on God intervening, right? And this idea of miracles. But yet when you hear them argue against this kind of problem, it almost seems like they are asking for God to intervene, right? They're asking for God to perform more miracles. Now, which one is it?
But I can say that I believe in God, and I know that even if I don't know what the explanation is, I trust that there probably is one. I just don't know what it is. A lot of people say that, and I say, okay, fine. But then if we rewind a moment to fine-tuning, and I say, look, this is a strange mystery, in the same way that for a Christian, suffering is a great mystery, but I'm sure there's an explanation even if I don't know what it is. When I'm confronted with the great mystery of fine-tuning, I think I reserve the right to say, look, I don't know what a scientific explanation of this could look like, but I'm sure that there is one and we'll get there someday, right? I think, in other words, the cop-out, to put it crudely, if we were treating it in that way, in the context of a discussion about it, can go both ways. So I just want to make that sort of put a pin in that. On the point of suffering, again, we run into this problem that, okay, broadly, maybe God has to bring about the world in a particular way. Maybe there has to be a kind of order. Maybe there has to be a kind of ecosystem. But it seems trivially true to me that an omnipotent deity could have organized the world so that there was not this kind of suffering.
I find it interesting that he starts off saying that the problem of suffering is a mystery for Christianity, almost as if they say that it's not a mystery for his worldview. On the whole fine-tuning thing, I hear his argument, but I would push back by saying that the difference is we have evidence for the fine-tuning of the universe. And when we factor in what we see in the world, this seems to point to a mind. He has to show how suffering doesn't make sense in a theistic worldview, how suffering is not compatible with Christianity. That's not something, and again, this is a clip, so I'm going to make sure I emphasize this. Perhaps he does this in the full-length interview. I haven't watched the whole thing. In the clip, he does not show how suffering is not compatible with Christianity or it's not compatible with a theistic worldview. That's something he has to show. Now, continuing this argument here, if there is a mind that put everything in order, like Francis Collins just said, then perhaps this mind has a reason for this suffering. Again, I just want to emphasize that he can't make this argument from his worldview. He has to borrow from other worldviews. He has to borrow from different ones to make his case. I think that shows that perhaps his worldview is lacking or is faulty.
With starvation and disease and predation, and just taking predation. When a lion kills a zebra, the zebra is usually too big to be killed instantly, so it will die over an agonizing death with its windpipe caught in the jaws of a lion. This could have been avoided. It doesn't seem to me that this kind of outcome is something that was necessary for producing the kind of ecosystem only through which could conscious human agents have come into existence to have loved God. I'm not even sure why the material world would need to exist in the first place if we're supposed to be ultimate.
Do you think all those observations that you're making are moral observations, though?
No, but that's a good question because, of course, people will say to me, look, Alex, you don't believe in morality or you don't have a grounding for morality. How can you make these moral criticisms? That's not what I'm doing. What I'm saying is, as Lincoln said of slavery, if this is not wrong, then nothing is wrong. I have no problem saying that, like, yeah, no, there's nothing wrong with predation and disease and starvation and all this kind of suffering. But that's an atheist paradigm. The atheist can say, well, there's nothing wrong with it, but we also expect it on our worldview. Right? The Christian says that this is a bad thing. We don't like that this is happening, but it is compatible with the existence of a good God.
This question goes back to, how do you know it's agonizing? And why do you feel such outrage about it? I think for him to say that from an atheist worldview, he doesn't have to say that it's wrong, right? That it's, makes sense in his worldview. But when you listen to him explain himself, he clearly feels like there's something wrong with this happening, right? It's almost like he's trying to separate his feelings from his intellect. And I would say that's not the best approach. Those things tend to work together. So again, the question is, why do you feel such outrage about it? Alex says he is an emotivist when it comes to morality, which basically means it's just based on your feelings. This is a tough topic to deal with, right? This is a tough thing to answer, this idea of animal suffering. But I think my worldview affords me that right. I don't think that his worldview does. I think it falls short. This is from Capturing Christianity, and this is actually based on a conversation that Cameron had with Alex a few years back. This is on his website. There's an article here on the topic of animal suffering. Not only is it wrong to assume suffering is alien to theism, but it also seems incorrect to assume naturalism better predicts a world of suffering. The arrival of beings with the necessary neural capacities to undergo suffering requires the confluence of many events: the right selection pressures, the oxidation event, a lack of apocalyptic natural disasters, etc. In other words, even if evolution is granted as background knowledge, naturalism will seem to entail that the evolution of conscious beings capable of experiencing pain is an unlikely event. So this is from William Lane Craig as well. This is from a more recent article. The evidence continues to confirm that sentient animals at level 2 lack a full self-awareness and do not suffer as human beings do. Talk of dimensions of animal consciousness. He's quoting here from Birch, Dimensions of Animal Consciousness. They explain that self-consciousness, which they define as the conscious awareness of oneself as distinct from the world outside, admits of gradations. So even though animals like dogs, cats, and horses experience pain, nevertheless, the evidence is that they do not experience level 3, the awareness that they themselves are at pain. For the awareness that one is oneself in pain requires full self-awareness, which is missing in all animals, except perhaps for the humanoid primates. All of this has enormous implications for the problem of animal suffering and for the doctrine of man's creation in the image of God. So it seems to me that what William Lane Craig is doing here, he is making a distinction between pain and suffering, which is something that you see repeatedly as you kind of look into this a bit. One of the sticking points here is that even though Alex does recognize that there are theodicies that explain this concept of animal suffering, the ones that he at least presents in the clip here are less thought out, right? The ones that he's presenting are ones that he kind of dismisses outright. Why not interact with some of these more in-depth and intellectual theodicies as opposed to these ones that you think can be dismissed outright? It seems to kind of be a bit of a straw man. So this is from Gavin Ortlund. Christians have believed for centuries that the human fall caused catastrophic events upon material creation. It seems reasonable, therefore, that the angelic fall may also have had a kind of spoiling or corrupting effect upon God's good creation. Dom Terwothen writes, it seems to be a general law that the lower orders should be governed by the higher ones, that God's creatures should be arranged in a hierarchy with a certain dependence of those below on those above. The principle that sin corrupts is not new. All that is new here is the application of this principle to the fall of angels and their continued presence in the world. So this goes back to what I read earlier, that perhaps the fall that has this effect on animals is not Adam's fall, but Satan's fall. I like Alex. I think he's one of the more well thought out atheists, at least when it comes to Christianity. I think he gives it he at least attempts to understand the worldview. So I'll give him credit for that. I do think that in this conversation and the conversation with Stuart and Cliff, it seemed like he set up some straw men that it was unfortunate. I hadn't really seen him make those arguments in the past. So that was kind of disappointing to an extent. But listen, if you're a big Alex fan, I get it. He is much better equipped than I am to engage in these conversations, which is why I'm going to people that are much smarter than I am, right? I'm pointing to people like William Lane Craig, pointing to people like Gavin Ortlund, and the article from Capturing Christianity. I don't remember the author's name. But that's why I'm going to those people and not relying on just what I think in my opinion. But anyway, let me know what you think in the comments. Thanks for tuning in. I'll catch you next time.